Welcome, gentle soul who seeks truth in shadows, to the mountain paths where moonlight reveals what daylight conceals, and ancient mysteries whisper through bamboo groves heavy with secrets. Tonight, we delve beyond the surface of heroism into the darker currents that flow beneath Demon Slayer's tale of courage and compassion. This is a journey into theories that chill the heart, truths that wound the spirit, and questions that linger like morning mist in forgotten valleys. Here lie the psychological depths that transform a story of demons and slayers into something far more haunting. An examination of what it truly means to lose one's humanity, to bear curses that span generations, and to fight battles where victory carries prices that may exceed the cost of defeat itself. So settle beneath your covers like shadows settling in ancient forests, and let the rhythm of contemplative breathing carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore every dark theory that haunts the world Tanjiro inherited. In the depths of the Heian period, when shadows stretched longer across Japan and medicine remained an art practiced by those who danced between healing and harm, there lived a physician whose name history has forgotten, but whose legacy would stain the world with blood for over 1,000 years. The man who would become Muzan Kibutsuji entered this world already marked by death, his body so frail and sickly that survival past his 20th year seemed an impossibility that even the most optimistic observers could not reasonably expect to witness. The doctor who attended him represented the finest medical knowledge that the late 8th century could provide, yet even his considerable expertise seemed inadequate when confronted with an illness that appeared to attack every system within the young man's failing body simultaneously. The symptoms that manifested suggested a condition that transcended ordinary disease categories, as if some fundamental aspect of life force itself was being systematically drained away through mechanisms that conventional understanding could not identify or address through any known therapeutic intervention. The experimental treatments that followed reflected the physician's growing desperation, as conventional remedies proved completely inadequate for addressing a condition that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of normal human pathology. The blue spider lily that became central to his final attempts at treatment was not chosen through systematic medical reasoning, but through intuitive understanding of natural forces that operated according to principles that formal education had never addressed or acknowledged as legitimate. Therapeutic approaches. The preparation of medicines that incorporated this mysterious flower required knowledge that existed at the intersection between botanical science and supernatural understanding, suggesting that the physician possessed insights into the relationship between plant properties and human physiology that exceeded anything his contemporary colleagues could have achieved through conventional study. The chemical compounds that existed within those ethereal blue petals carried potential for transformation that extended far beyond simple healing into realms that touched upon the fundamental nature of life and death themselves. The patient's response to these experimental treatments initially appeared to validate the physician's innovative approach, as strength began returning to limbs that had been weakened by months of progressive deterioration, while mental clarity improved in ways that suggested the treatment was addressing root causes rather than merely managing symptoms. The subtle changes in skin tone and energy levels indicated metabolic improvements that seemed to promise complete recovery from a condition that had appeared terminal just weeks before. Yet Muzan's impatience with the gradual pace of recovery reflected personality traits that would prove crucial for understanding how his eventual transformation would unfold, as his inability to accept uncertainty or delay created psychological pressure that demanded immediate results rather than allowing natural healing processes to proceed according to their own timeline. The rage that built within him as he contemplated the possibility that improvement might plateau or reverse demonstrated how completely his identity had become dependent upon achieving perfect health, regardless of what risks such achievement might entail. The moment when fury overwhelmed gratitude marked a turning point that transformed potential salvation into guaranteed damnation, as Muzan's decision to take the physician's life eliminated the only person who understood the experimental treatment's mechanisms and could have guided its completion or reversal if dangerous side effects began to manifest. The blood that stained his hands carried symbolic weight that exceeded its immediate tragedy, representing the first step in a transformation that would eventually require countless additional murders to sustain itself. The death that should have ended his story instead became its true beginning, as the medicine that had been intended to preserve life began working in ways that its creator had never anticipated or intended, transforming cellular structures according to patterns that existed outside normal biological parameters. The strength that flowed through his regenerating body carried with it changes that were simultaneously miraculous and monstrous, granting capabilities that exceeded human limitations while imposing requirements that would make peaceful existence impossible. The first taste of human flesh that followed his physical transformation represented not merely dietary change, but fundamental alteration of psychological relationship to other human beings, as those who had once been companions and equals became nothing more than potential sources of sustenance for appetites that conventional food could no longer satisfy. The horror of this realization was matched by the ecstasy of consumption, creating psychological conflict that would define his existence throughout the centuries that followed. The sunlight that had once warmed his sickly body now became deadly enemy that could reduce him to ash within moments, creating imprisonment within darkness that transformed the freedom his strength should have provided into eternal constraint that made his power meaningful only during hours when most human activity ceased. The irony of gaining capabilities that could only be exercised when others could not witness or benefit from them created existential frustration that would fuel his later obsession with overcoming this fundamental limitation. The realization that his transformation was incomplete, that he remained vulnerable to the very element that gave life to the world around him, created psychological torment that exceeded any physical pain he had experienced during his original illness. The knowledge that perfect power remained just beyond his reach, blocked by biological constraints that seemed arbitrary yet proved immutable, established patterns of thinking that would drive him to commit increasingly desperate acts in pursuit of completion that might forever remain beyond his grasp. The blue spider lily that had enabled his original transformation became simultaneously salvation and curse, representing the key to achieving the immunity to sunlight that would make his power truly absolute while remaining hidden from him. Through timing that seemed designed to perpetuate his suffering, the flower's blooming pattern, restricted to brief daylight periods during only 2 or 3 days each year, created natural protection against his search that was more effective than any human defense could have been. The systematic elimination of everyone who had known the original physician removed potential sources of information about the flower's properties or location, while creating gaps in historical record that would make future research almost impossible, even for those with resources and motivation that exceeded what ordinary humans could bring to such investigations. Each murder that was intended to preserve secrecy actually made the knowledge he sought more elusive, creating a self-defeating cycle that ensured his quest would continue indefinitely. The centuries that followed became endless repetition of hope and disappointment, as Muzan's search for the blue spider lily continued through changing social conditions and technological developments that should have made the task easier, yet somehow never provided the breakthrough that would enable him to achieve his ultimate goal. the flower gardens he sponsored, the botanical experts he consulted or consumed, the scholarly research he supported, all proved inadequate for locating blooms that existed within the same geographical regions he frequented, yet remained invisible to his investigations. The transformation of other humans into demons represented both practical necessity for maintaining organizational structure and psychological compensation for his inability to achieve perfect form, as creating subordinates who shared his general nature while remaining inferior to his capabilities, provided sense of accomplishment that his failed search for the spider lily could not supply. The blood that flowed from his body into willing and unwilling recipients carried with it fragment of his own cursed existence, while creating beings whose loyalty could be ensured through supernatural bonds that made betrayal impossible. The hierarchy that emerged from these transformation activities reflected Muzan's need to maintain control over forces that his own creation had set in motion. As demons whose individual capabilities approached his own posed theoretical threats that required careful management through systems of reward and punishment that kept even the most powerful subordinates dependent upon his continued approval for their survival and advancement. The 12 Kazuki structure that formalized these relationships created stability within demon society, while ensuring that no individual could accumulate enough power to challenge his authority directly. The experiments that he conducted using his demon subordinates as test subjects represented attempts to solve through systematic research the problem that random searching had failed to address, as their enhanced capabilities and diverse blood demon arts might provide insights into transformation mechanics that could guide more effective approaches to achieving sunlight immunity. The casual cruelty with which he treated these experimental subjects reflected not merely sadistic pleasure, but rational calculation, that their individual welfare mattered less than advancing research that could benefit the entire demon species. The failures that accumulated through these experimental programs created psychological pressure that manifested through increasingly erratic behavior patterns and destructive responses to setbacks that would once have been accepted as normal aspects of long-term research projects. The perfectionism that had originally motivated his search became rigid obsession that prevented adaptive thinking and created blind spots that made effective problem-solving impossible despite centuries of accumulated experience and resources. The intelligence networks that he established to monitor human activities for any mention of blue spider lilies represented massive investment of time and energy that yielded comprehensive knowledge about botanical research and flower cultivation, while never producing the specific information that would make his quest successful. The irony of knowing more about plant biology than most professional botanists while remaining unable to locate the single species that mattered to him created frustration that poisoned every apparent success with reminders of continued failure. The psychological deterioration that accompanied these repeated disappointments manifested through paranoid thinking patterns and violent responses to minor setbacks that suggested the extended lifespan his transformation had provided was creating mental strain that human consciousness had never been designed to withstand. The memories that accumulated across centuries of existence became burden rather than resource, as each failed attempt to locate the spider lily joined countless others in creating weight of disappointment that threatened to crush hope entirely. The moments when evidence suggested that the blue spider lily might be extinct, that his original transformation had depended upon access to biological material that no longer existed anywhere in the world, created despair so profound that even his supernatural resilience seemed inadequate for managing the psychological impact of such revelations. The possibility that his quest was not merely difficult but actually impossible challenged fundamental assumptions about reality and justice that had sustained him through centuries of setbacks and failures. The alternative theories that emerged from this despair suggested that the spider lily's properties might be replicated through synthetic chemistry or biological engineering techniques that human science had not yet developed but might achieve, given sufficient time and research. Investment. The decision to infiltrate human society and influence scientific development toward goals that aligned with his personal needs represented evolution in strategic thinking that moved beyond simple searching toward active manipulation of research priorities and funding allocation. The identity that he constructed as successful businessman and family man provided perfect cover for activities that required social respectability, while enabling him to direct resources toward projects whose true purposes remained hidden from human collaborators who believed they were working on conventional medical or pharmaceutical research. The performance of human normalcy that this role required created additional psychological strain as he was forced to suppress instincts and behaviors that had become natural during centuries of existing as apex predator. The wife and child who completed his human disguise represented both tactical necessity and curious experiment in emotional attachment, as their presence in his life created opportunities to study human family dynamics from perspective of sustained, intimate observation, rather than brief, predatory encounters. The genuine affection that developed despite his expectations suggested that transformation into demon had not eliminated all capacity for emotional connection, though such feelings remained subordinate to survival needs and strategic objectives. The laboratory facilities that he established under various corporate identities became centers for research that combined legitimate scientific methodology with supernatural experimentation in ways that pushed boundaries of ethical conduct while advancing understanding of biological transformation, processes that conventional researchers could never have achieved through approved protocols. The human subjects who contributed to this research often did so unknowingly, their participation secured through economic pressure or social manipulation rather than informed consent. The breakthrough that finally revealed the blue spider lily's location came not through systematic searching or scientific research, but through accidental discovery by subordinate, whose assignment had focused on entirely different objectives, demonstrating how chance continued to play a crucial role in outcomes that centuries of planning and effort had been unable to guarantee. The irony that success arrived through luck rather than skill created mixed emotions that included triumph, shadowed by recognition that earlier success might have been possible if different approaches had been tried. The flower that had haunted his existence for over a millennium proved surprisingly fragile when finally located, its petals decomposing rapidly once removed from living plant, while its essential properties seemed to diminish with each moment of separation from natural growing conditions. The race against botanical decay that followed discovery created urgency that transformed careful scientific analysis into desperate preservation attempts that risked destroying the very material he sought to study. The realization that the spider lily's power could not be extracted through conventional methods, that its transformation potential required specific timing and preparation techniques that had died with the original physician, created new category of despair that exceeded even centuries of failed searching. The knowledge that he possessed the flower, but lacked understanding of how to use it effectively, represented tantalizingly cruel twist of fate that seemed designed to maximize his psychological suffering. The experiments that followed attempted to reverse engineer the original physician's methodology through systematic testing of preparation techniques and timing variations that might unlock the flower's transformative potential, yet each failure brought him closer to depleting his limited supply of irreplaceable biological material, while moving no nearer to achieving immunity that remained his ultimate goal. The pressure of working with finite resources created anxiety that interfered with clear thinking and made mistakes more likely at precisely the moments when precision was most crucial for success. The theory that emerged from these failed experiments suggested that the blue spider lily's effectiveness might depend not merely on chemical properties, but on environmental conditions or spiritual factors that existed at the time of season. Muzan's original transformation but could not be recreated in contemporary settings. The possibility that his quest was doomed by historical circumstances beyond his control represented ultimate philosophical challenge to worldview that had been built around belief that sufficient effort and resources could overcome any obstacle. And so the first demon's story reveals itself to be not merely tale of supernatural transformation, but examination of how perfectionism becomes prison, how strength without completion creates eternal weakness, and how the pursuit of absolute power leads inevitably to absolute isolation that makes such power meaningless even when achieved. The Demon Slayer mark manifests like a flower blooming in fast forward upon human skin, its intricate patterns spreading across flesh with supernatural beauty that conceals the most terrible curse ever to afflict those who dedicate their lives to protecting others from demonic evil. The marks that appear during moments of extreme combat stress create visual transformation that seems to celebrate the warrior's evolution towards something greater than baseline humanity. Yet beneath this aesthetic enhancement lies biological countdown that ensures every marked demon slayer will die before reaching their 25th birthday, creating generation of heroes doomed to brief but brilliant existence. The process through which these marks manifest remains shrouded in mystery that even the most experienced Hashira cannot fully explain. Though all who have witnessed their appearance agree that the transformation occurs during moments when normal human limitations prove inadequate for survival against supernatural threats whose power exceeds anything conventional training can prepare warriors to face. The physiological changes that accompany mark manifestation extend far beyond surface decoration to encompass fundamental alterations in cardiovascular function, muscular capacity, and neurological processing speed that enable performance levels previously believed impossible for human physiology to sustain. The enhanced strength that flows through marked warriors transforms their bodies into weapons capable of matching demons whose supernatural advantages had previously made them nearly invincible against human opponents. Yet this power comes through acceleration of biological processes that compress normal lifespans into periods too brief for the human heart to sustain indefinitely. The metabolism that enables such extraordinary capability burns through cellular resources with intensity that creates permanent damage to organs and systems that were never designed to operate at such extreme levels for extended periods. The historical precedent for this curse extends back through generations of demon slayers whose exceptional abilities enabled them to achieve legendary status while condemning them to deaths that came decades earlier than natural lifespans should have allowed, creating pattern of sacrifice that transformed the most capable warriors into martyrs whose service to humanity required accepting premature mortality as inevitable consequence of accessing power necessary for protecting others. The records that document these early deaths reveal consistent timing that suggests supernatural mechanism rather than coincidental medical conditions affecting individuals whose enhanced capabilities should have made them more resistant to ordinary health problems. The research that Demon Slayer medical specialists conducted into mark-related mortality uncovered biological changes that appeared to violate fundamental principles of human longevity, As cellular aging accelerated at rates that seemed impossible under normal circumstances, while organ systems experienced stress patterns that resembled those seen in individuals decades older than the affected warriors' actual chronological ages, the cellular examination of marked demon slayers revealed mitochondrial damage and genetic expression changes that indicated their enhanced capabilities were purchased through systematic destruction of biological foundation required for long-term survival. The psychological impact of learning about the Mark's curse creates burden that exceeds even the physical toll of accelerated aging, as warriors who have dedicated their lives to saving others must confront reality that their greatest achievements will be purchased through forfeiture of futures they had hoped to share with loved ones whose welfare motivated their original commitment to Demon Slayer service. The knowledge that enhanced power comes with built-in expiration date transforms every moment of strength into reminder of approaching death. That conventional heroism, at least, allowed warriors to hope they might survive to enjoy. The attempts that various Demon Slayer Corps medical researchers made to counteract or reverse the Mark's effects through pharmaceutical intervention yielded comprehensive understanding of the biological mechanisms involved, while proving completely ineffective at preventing or delaying the inevitable outcome that claimed every marked warrior with mathematical precision that suggested supernatural rather than purely biological causation. The failure of conventional medicine to address Mark-related mortality indicated that the curse operated according to principles that existed beyond normal understanding of human physiology and therapeutic intervention. The exception that Yoriichi represented to this otherwise absolute pattern of early death created tantalizing hope that the curse might not be truly inevitable. Yet his unique survival past the 25-year threshold remained mysterious anomaly that no other marked Demon Slayer had been able to replicate, despite desperate attempts to understand and duplicate whatever factors had enabled his longevity. The analysis of Yoriichi's case revealed no obvious differences in Mark appearance, combat abilities, or lifestyle factors that could explain why he alone escaped the fate that claimed every other warrior who achieved similar levels of enhancement. The theories that emerged from studying Yoriichi's exceptional survival proposed various mechanisms that might have protected him from the Mark's lethal effects, ranging from unique genetic factors that provided natural resistance to the aging acceleration, to spiritual qualities that enabled him to harmonize enhanced capabilities with normal biological processes in ways that other warriors could not achieve through conscious effort or training. The investigation into his background and abilities revealed extraordinary characteristics that exceeded even typical marked Demon Slayer capabilities, suggesting that his immunity might be connected to the same factors that made him uniquely powerful rather than representing hope that ordinary marked warriors might also survive. The possibility that Yoriichi's sun-breathing mastery provided protection against the Mark's curse created theoretical framework for understanding how different breathing techniques might interact with the enhancement process in ways that could influence survival outcomes. Yet, attempts to train other marked warriors in sun-breathing principles failed to prevent their deaths at the expected age, while sometimes accelerating the deterioration process through techniques that proved incompatible with their existing Mark manifestations. The complexity of breathing technique interactions with Mark biology indicated that simple adoption of Yoriichi's methods would not be sufficient to replicate his survival. The spiritual dimension that some researchers believed might explain Yoriichi's immunity suggested that the Mark's curse operated through mechanisms that encompassed more than purely physical processes, potentially involving metaphysical aspects of human nature that most warriors never developed sufficiently to provide protection against supernatural aging effects. The investigation into spiritual factors that might influence Mark's survival revealed connections between meditation practices, emotional states, and biological aging that suggested psychological approaches to longevity that conventional medicine had never explored or validated through systematic study. The implications of the Mark curse for Demon Slayer Corps. Operational planning created strategic dilemmas that forced leadership to balance immediate combat effectiveness against long-term sustainability of warrior population, as promoting Mark manifestation among promising recruits would enhance their ability to defeat powerful demons while guaranteeing loss of those same warriors within predictable timeframes that made succession planning both crucial, heartbreaking. The ethical considerations involved in encouraging young people to accept enhancement that would save countless lives while costing them their own futures created moral complexity that had no clear resolution. The psychological counseling that marked warriors received focused on helping them accept abbreviated lifespans while maintaining motivation and combat effectiveness, despite knowledge that every victory brought them closer to death that could not be postponed through any known means, creating therapeutic challenges that conventional approaches to mortality anxiety were inadequately equipped to address. The counselors who worked with marked demon slayers developed specialized techniques for managing despair and hopelessness that could undermine combat performance while helping warriors find meaning in service that would not extend beyond their early 20s. The family relationships that marked warriors maintained became complicated by awareness that time remaining for personal connections was severely limited, creating urgency around marriage, parenthood, and other life experiences that typically could be postponed until career obligations were fulfilled but now required immediate attention if they were to be experienced at all. The decisions about whether to pursue romantic relationships and have children when death was guaranteed before those children reached adulthood created emotional dilemmas that isolated marked warriors from normal social experiences and expectations. The legacy planning that marked warriors engaged in reflected their need to ensure that their abbreviated lives would have lasting positive impact, despite their inability to personally oversee long-term implementation of projects and relationships they initiated during their brief periods of enhanced capability. The wills, letters, and institutional arrangements they created attempted to extend their influence beyond biological death while providing guidance and resources that could benefit others, even after the warriors themselves were no longer available to offer direct support and protection. The training programs that were developed specifically for marked warriors reflected understanding that their enhanced capabilities required different approaches to skill development and tactical planning, as conventional Demon Slayer education assumed lifespans that would allow gradual progression through increasingly challenging assignments over periods spanning decades rather than years. The accelerated curriculum that marked warriors followed compressed advanced techniques and strategic knowledge into timeframes that maximized their combat effectiveness during the brief periods when their enhancement remained active. The medical monitoring that marked warriors underwent attempted to track the progression of biological changes associated with their enhanced capabilities while providing early warning of health complications that might affect combat performance before final deterioration made continued service impossible. The sophisticated testing protocols that were developed revealed detailed understanding of how mark-related aging affected different organ systems while remaining unable to prevent or significantly delay the ultimate outcome that claimed every enhanced warrior with predictable timing. The research into hereditary factors that might influence mark manifestation and survival focused on family lines that had produced multiple demon slayers with exceptional abilities, seeking genetic patterns that might explain why certain individuals developed marks while others with similar training and dedication never experienced enhancement despite facing equally dangerous combat situations. The genealogical studies revealed complex inheritance patterns that suggested mark potential might be influenced by multiple genetic factors rather than simple dominant or recessive traits. The attempts to artificially induce mark manifestation through controlled stress exposure and intensive training created experimental programs that tested human limits while seeking to identify specific conditions that triggered enhancement in individuals who had not naturally developed marks during conventional combat encounters. The results of these experiments revealed that artificial mark induction was possible under extreme circumstances while consistently producing the same fatal aging effects that characterized natural manifestation, indicating that the enhancement and curse were inseparably linked regardless of how the marks were initially triggered. The philosophical questions that arose from studying the mark curse challenged fundamental assumptions about heroism, sacrifice, and the acceptable costs of protecting others from supernatural evil, as the certainty of early death for enhanced warriors created moral dilemma about whether encouraging mark development represented noble dedication to service or exploitation of young people's willingness to sacrifice their futures for abstract ideals. The debate among Demon Slayer leadership about mark enhancement policies reflected deeper disagreements about organizational responsibility for warrior welfare versus operational effectiveness in supernatural warfare. The documentation of final months for marked warriors revealed consistent patterns of physical and psychological changes that accompanied the terminal phase of mark-related aging, providing detailed understanding of what enhanced warriors could expect as their abbreviated lifespans approached conclusion, while offering opportunities for medical intervention that might reduce suffering even if death could not be prevented. The palliative care protocols that were developed specifically for marked warriors addressed unique symptoms and complications that differed significantly from normal aging processes or conventional terminal illnesses. The moments when marked warriors reached their 24th birthdays carried special significance as psychological milestones that forced confrontation with mortality in ways that healthy young adults normally never experienced, creating opportunities for spiritual growth and emotional resolution that might not have occurred under normal circumstances, while intensifying awareness of time's passage that could make remaining months feel simultaneously precious and terrifyingly brief. The celebration and mourning that characterized these birthdays reflected complex emotions that combined joy for achievements accomplished with grief for futures that would never be experienced. The final battles that many marked warriors chose to engage during their last months of life represented attempts to maximize the positive impact of their abbreviated existence, while ensuring that enhanced capabilities would be fully utilized for protecting others before biological decline made continued combat impossible. The strategic deployment of warriors who knew their deaths were imminent created tactical advantages that could be devastating to demonic forces, while guaranteeing that human sacrifices would achieve maximum effectiveness in advancing broader objectives. The theories that emerged about breaking the mark curse through various supernatural or scientific interventions reflected desperate hope that enhanced warriors might somehow escape the fate that had claimed every previous generation of places marked demon slayers. Yet the consistent failure of all attempted solutions indicated that the curse represented fundamental law of supernatural enhancement rather than problem that could be solved through sufficient research and determination. The acceptance that marked warriors eventually reached regarding their abbreviated lifespans often coincided with spiritual growth that enabled them to find meaning in service despite its ultimate cost. The legacy that marked warriors left behind extended far beyond their individual combat achievements, to encompass inspiration and guidance that influenced subsequent generations of demon slayers, who could learn from their examples, while hoping to avoid similar fates through different approaches to enhancement and combat methodology. The stories and techniques that survived their deaths became foundation for continued resistance against demonic evil, while serving as monuments to sacrifice that enabled others to live full lifespans in worlds made safer through abbreviated service of enhanced heroes. And so the mark reveals itself to be simultaneously gift and curse, offering power sufficient to protect humanity, while demanding payment that transforms heroes into martyrs, whose greatest strength becomes source of inevitable weakness, creating legacy of sacrifice that inspires and haunts all who follow in their footsteps. The 12 Kazuki hierarchy stands as monument to organized cruelty that transforms supernatural evil from chaotic predation into systematic oppression, creating power structure where demons compete for advancement through methods so brutal that even creatures who have abandoned human morality find themselves horrified by the depths of degradation required to climb ranks within Muzan's carefully orchestrated system of eternal servitude. The positions within this demonic aristocracy are purchased not with currency or political favor, but with accumulated suffering, inflicted upon both human victims and fellow demons, creating economy of pain where advancement requires demonstrating increasingly creative approaches to causing anguish that exceeds what competitors have achieved. The selection process that determines which demons earn positions among the 12 most powerful servants operates according to criteria that transcend simple combat effectiveness to encompass psychological sophistication, strategic thinking, and capacity for inflicting trauma that extends beyond immediate physical damage into realms of mental and spiritual destruction that can persist long after wounds have healed. The candidates who seek these positions must prove themselves through trials that test not merely their ability to kill efficiently, but their willingness to embrace methods that violate every principle of mercy or restraint that might have survived their transformation from human to monster. The lower moon positions that comprise the bottom half of the hierarchy serve as proving grounds where newly powerful demons can demonstrate worthiness for advancement while learning organizational culture that prioritizes absolute loyalty to Muzan over all other considerations, including personal, survival, individual goals, or relationships with other demons who might be eliminated without warning if their continued existence conflicts with strategic objectives or personal whims of their supreme leader. The competition among lower moons creates atmosphere of constant suspicion and betrayal that prevents alliance formation, while ensuring that each demon remains focused on individual advancement rather than collective resistance. The promotion system that governs advancement from lower to upper moon status requires not merely defeating current position holders, but doing so in ways that demonstrate superior understanding of how to maximize victim suffering while advancing Muzan's broader objectives of spreading fear and chaos throughout human society. The battles that determine rank changes often involve elaborate competitions where demons are judged not only on combat outcomes, but on creativity, displayed in torture techniques, psychological manipulation methods, and ability to corrupt human nature through exposure to horrors that drive victims toward despair and moral compromise. The upper moon demons, who occupy the 6 highest positions within the hierarchy, represent pinnacle of demonic evolution as measured by their ability to serve Muzan's interests while maintaining personal power that approaches his own in specific areas of expertise. Yet, their elevated status comes with increased scrutiny and higher expectations that make failure more dangerous than it would be for lower-ranking demons, who might receive second chances that upper moons cannot expect. The pressure associated with maintaining elite status creates psychological stress that manifests through increasingly desperate attempts to prove continued relevance and loyalty through escalating displays of cruelty and effectiveness. The numbering system that identifies each demon's rank within the hierarchy appears permanently etched into their physical forms through supernatural markings that cannot be concealed or altered except through legitimate advancement or emotion, creating visible reminder of status that influences all social interactions within demon society, while serving as constant motivation for improvement that drives competitive behavior. The shame associated with lower numbers and pride connected to higher ranks creates emotional investment in hierarchical position that makes demons willing to sacrifice almost anything to avoid losing status that has become central to their sense of identity and self-worth. The meetings that bring members of the 12 Kizuki together for strategic planning and status updates create opportunities for social dynamics that blend professional cooperation with personal animosity in ways that reflect the planing, fundamental tension between collective effectiveness and individual ambition that characterizes all totalitarian organizations. The careful etiquette that governs these interactions masks underlying hostility that could explode into violence if not carefully managed through protocols that acknowledge rank differences while preventing disputes that might weaken overall organizational effectiveness through internal conflict. The territories that each 12 Kizuki member controls represent feudal domains where they exercise absolute authority over both human and demon populations, while remaining subject to Muzan's ultimate oversight and intervention whenever their local activities conflict with broader strategic objectives or fail to meet productivity standards measured in terms of human casualties, fear generation, and intelligence gathering about Demon Slayer operations. The administrative responsibilities that accompany these territorial assignments require demons to develop skills in governance and resource management that extend far beyond simple predatory behavior into complex organizational leadership. The tribute system that flows upward through the hierarchy ensures that Muzan receives share of all benefits generated by subordinate activities, while each demon retains sufficient rewards to maintain motivation for continued service, creating economic structure that binds individual success to collective prosperity while making rebellion economically irrational, even for demons with sufficient power to challenge specific aspects of organizational policy. The careful calibration of reward distribution prevents accumulation of resources that might enable independence, while ensuring that loyal service provides lifestyle improvements that make continued participation attractive. The punishment protocols that govern responses to failure, insubordination, or suspected disloyalty operate through mechanisms that exceed simple execution to encompass psychological torture, public humiliation, and gradual deterioration of status and privilege that can extend over periods lasting decades or centuries depending upon severity of infractions, and Muzan's assessment of whether rehabilitation remains possible or desirable. The variety of disciplinary measures available creates uncertainty about consequences that makes potential rebels hesitant to act, while demonstrating to other demons the range of suffering that awaits those who disappoint their supreme leader. The curse that prevents 12 Kizuki members from revealing information about Muzan or organizational operations operates through supernatural mechanisms that cause immediate death whenever affected demons attempt to communicate sensitive details to unauthorized recipients, creating security system that makes betrayal literally impossible, while eliminating need for conventional counterintelligence measures that might prove inadequate against supernatural threats. The biological implementation of this curse suggests level of control over demon physiology that enables Muzan to monitor and manipulate his subordinates in ways that exceed psychological influence to encompass direct intervention in their mental and physical processes. The side effects of carrying this curse extend beyond simple information security to encompass constant awareness of supernatural surveillance that creates psychological pressure, resembling that experienced by subjects of totalitarian surveillance state, as demons must constantly monitor their own thoughts and communications to avoid triggering lethal responses to mental activities that might be interpreted as treasonous, even if no actual betrayal was intended. The paranoia that results from living under such absolute monitoring creates social isolation that prevents meaningful relationships while reinforcing dependence upon Muzan for all forms of social connection and emotional support. The testing that occasionally occurs when Muzan deliberately exposes demons to situations where curse activation would be likely serves to verify continued effectiveness of control mechanisms while demonstrating to other organization members the reality of supernatural surveillance that makes resistance futile, regardless of personal power levels or strategic advantages that rebels might believe they possess. The casual cruelty with which these tests are conducted illustrates complete disregard for subordinate welfare, while establishing psychological dominance that transcends simple fear to encompass learned helplessness that makes resistance psychologically impossible. The replacement process that occurs when 12 Kazuki positions become vacant through death, promotion, or demotion creates opportunities for advancement that generate intense competition among demons who seek elite status, while establishing precedent that no position within the hierarchy provides permanent security against removal if performance standards are not consistently maintained. The speed with which replacements are identified and installed demonstrates organizational depth that ensures continuity of operations while preventing power vacuums that might create opportunities for rebellion or external exploitation. The training programs that prepare newly promoted demons for increased responsibilities reflect understanding that elite positions require capabilities that extend beyond combat effectiveness to encompass leadership skills, strategic thinking, and psychological manipulation techniques that enable management of complex operations involving multiple subordinate demons and extensive human populations. The curriculum that guides this education includes instruction in torture, methodology, psychological warfare, organizational management, and political manipulation that transforms successful killers into sophisticated administrators of evil. The psychological profiles that determine suitability for specific positions within the hierarchy reflect careful analysis of individual demons' capabilities, personality traits, and psychological weaknesses that could be exploited to ensure continued loyalty while maximizing effectiveness in assigned roles. The placement decisions that result from this analysis create organizational structure where each demon's unique abilities are utilized optimally, while their personal limitations are managed through strategic positioning that prevents individual weaknesses from undermining collective effectiveness. The communication networks that connect 12 Kazuki members enable coordination of activities across vast geographical distances, while maintaining operational security that prevents Demon Slayer intelligence gathering from compromising strategic planning or advance warning of major operations. The supernatural communication methods employed suggest technological capabilities that exceed conventional human limitations, while remaining vulnerable to specific countermeasures that knowledgeable opponents might employ to disrupt organizational coordination during critical operations. The intelligence operations that each 12 Kazuki member conducts within their assigned territories generate comprehensive understanding of human population dynamics, demon slayer activities, and potential threats to organizational objectives, while contributing to centralized knowledge base that enables strategic planning at scales that individual demons could never achieve through personal observation and analysis. The systematic nature of this intelligence gathering creates a surveillance network that monitors human society with thoroughness that approaches omniscience within areas of active demon operation. The cultural development that has occurred within 12 Kizuki society reflects centuries of organizational evolution that has created customs, traditions, and social hierarchies that exist independently of Muzan's direct control, while remaining aligned with his strategic objectives through careful cultivation of values and behaviors that support collective goals. The ceremonies, rituals, and informal practices that characterize demon, elite social interactions demonstrate sophisticated civilization that has developed around shared commitment to spreading supernatural evil throughout human society. The psychological conditioning that shapes 12 Kizuki behavior operates through reward and punishment systems that reinforce desired attitudes while eliminating thoughts and emotions that might interfere with organizational effectiveness, creating personality changes that transform demons into ideal servants whose individual identities become subordinate to collective mission while retaining sufficient personal autonomy to enable creative problem-solving and strategic innovation. The balance between control and independence that characterizes this conditioning reflects careful understanding of how to maximize servant effectiveness while preventing development of capabilities that might threaten organizational stability. The recruitment strategies that identify potential candidates for 12 Kizuki positions focus on demons who demonstrate exceptional capabilities while showing psychological characteristics that suggest suitability for increased responsibility and closer integration into organizational hierarchy, creating selection process that identifies individuals whose natural tendencies align with elite demon culture, while screening out personalities that might prove disruptive or unreliable under increased pressure and scrutiny. And so, the 12 Kizuki reveals itself as masterpiece of organizational evil that transforms individual malice into systematic oppression, creating structure where demons compete to inflict maximum suffering, while binding themselves ever more tightly to system that ultimately serves only their supreme leader's twisted vision of perfect world where human civilization exists solely to provide entertainment and sustenance for supernatural predators who have forgotten they were once human themselves. The Hashira, who serve as pillars of the Demon Slayer core, carry within their hearts wounds so profound that their extraordinary strength emerges not despite their trauma but because of it. Each pillar forged through fires of personal loss that would have destroyed lesser souls, yet instead transformed them into warriors whose dedication to protecting others springs from intimate knowledge of what it means to lose everything that makes existence meaningful. Their stories unfold like dark flowers blooming in graveyards, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, revealing how the human spirit can survive unimaginable suffering while channeling that pain into purpose that transcends individual healing to encompass salvation of countless strangers who will never know the depths of sacrifice made on their behalf. The Wind Hashira Sanemi Shinazugawa emerged from childhood that resembled prolonged nightmare where safety existed only in brief moments between episodes of violence that taught him to expect betrayal from those who should have provided protection, his family home becoming battleground, where love and terror intermingled until distinguishing between them became impossible for children whose formative experiences included watching their mother transform from source of comfort into agent of destruction. The night when their mother's transformation into demon forced Sanemi to make choice between filial duty and survival of his remaining siblings created psychological fracture that would never fully heal, as the necessity of killing the woman who had given him life established pattern of sacrifice that would define every subsequent relationship he attempted to form. The younger brother Genya, who witnessed this matricidal mercy killing, developed trauma responses that prevented him from understanding the protective motivation behind Sanemi's actions, instead perceiving them as evidence of homicidal madness that threatened his own survival while making reconciliation impossible, despite their shared loss and mutual need for family connection that could help heal wounds inflicted by circumstances beyond either brother's control. The hatred that Genya directed towards Sanemi reflected not merely misunderstanding of that terrible night's events, but psychological defense mechanism that provided target for rage that might otherwise have consumed him entirely through self-directed destruction. The years that followed this family catastrophe saw Sanemi channel his grief and guilt into increasingly dangerous demon-hunting activities that served both as penance for perceived failures as brother and son, while providing outlet for violence that had become his primary method for processing emotions too complex and painful for normal psychological mechanisms to address effectively. The scars that accumulated across his body told story of encounters where survival seemed less important than punishment, as if physical pain could somehow balance spiritual anguish that threatened to overwhelm his capacity for continued existence. The Morechi blood that flowed through Sanemi's veins created additional burden, as his rare blood type made him irresistibly attractive to demons, whose enhanced response to his scent transformed every mission into guaranteed combat. Encounter, while making peaceful resolution impossible even in situations where negotiation might have saved both human and demon lives. The knowledge that his very presence escalated conflicts created psychological pressure that reinforced his belief that violence was an inevitable aspect of existence rather than choice that might sometimes be avoided through alternative approaches to problem solving. The water Hashira Giyu Tomioka carried guilt that originated from childhood trauma, involving the deaths of his sister and best friend, losses that occurred during demon attacks where his survival seemed to violate natural justice that should have claimed his life instead of theirs, creating survivor's guilt so profound that he spent subsequent years questioning whether his continued existence served any meaningful purpose, or merely prolonged cosmic error that had allowed wrong person to live. The emotional numbness that characterized his adult personality reflected psychological defense against pain that threatened to destroy his sanity if experienced directly, yet this protection came at cost of isolation that prevented him from forming connections that might have facilitated healing. The final selection, where Giyu's friend Sabito died protecting other candidates, including Giyu himself, established pattern of receiving salvation through others' sacrifice that reinforced his belief that he was unworthy of survival, while creating obligation to honor fallen friends through service that could never adequately repay debts that death had made impossible to settle. The knowledge that Sabito's exceptional abilities should have guaranteed his survival, while Giyu's inferior skills somehow enabled his escape, created logical paradox that challenged fundamental assumptions about justice and merit, in ways that made accepting good fortune psychologically impossible. The relationship with Tanjiro that eventually developed provided Giyu with opportunity to break cycle of survivor's guilt through protecting someone whose circumstances resembled his own, while enabling him to experience mentorship, role that allowed him to give, rather than merely receive, salvation from others whose sacrifice had enabled his survival. The gradual emotional thawing that occurred through these interactions suggested that healing remained possible, even for trauma that had seemed permanently disabling, though progress required accepting vulnerability that his defensive mechanisms had been designed to prevent. The insect Hashira Shinobu Kocho transformed her natural inclination toward compassion and healing into systematic pursuit of vengeance that corrupted medical knowledge into methodology for inflicting death through poisons that caused suffering designed to match psychological pain she experienced. Following her sister Kanai's murder by Upper Moon Demon, whose casual cruelty had eliminated source of love and guidance that had given meaning to Shinobu's existence. The smile that became her constant expression served as mask that concealed rage so intense that direct acknowledgement might have destroyed her capacity for rational thought, while enabling her to function socially despite internal, emotional chaos that threatened to consume her entirely. The research into demon physiology that occupied much of Shinobu's time represented an attempt to understand enemies well enough to develop methods for killing them that would satisfy desire for revenge, while contributing to broader demon slayer objectives through advancement of scientific knowledge that could benefit future warriors who faced similar opponents. The laboratory work that consumed her attention provided psychological refuge from grief that remained too painful for direct processing, while creating sense of progress toward goals that could justify continued existence despite loss of person whose welfare had previously provided primary motivation for living. The poison techniques that she developed reflected understanding that conventional sword combat would prove inadequate given her physical limitations, while creating opportunity to demonstrate that intelligence and preparation could overcome disadvantages in strength and speed through application of scientific principles that transformed weakness into tactical advantage. The satisfaction she derived from demon deaths caused by her toxins reflected not merely professional pride, but psychological compensation for powerlessness she had experienced when unable to prevent her sister's murder despite medical knowledge that should have enabled her to provide protection. The sound Hashira Tengen Uzui carried trauma that originated from ninja clan upbringing, where survival required abandoning normal human emotional responses in favor of calculating pragmatism that treated all relationships as strategic assets rather than sources of genuine connection, creating personality structure that enabled exceptional combat effectiveness, while preventing development of capacity for intimacy that could make life meaningful beyond simple mission completion. The three wives who accompanied him represented both tactical advantages that enhanced his operational capabilities and emotional anchors that provided motivation for survival, while creating vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit to compromise his judgment during critical moments. The selection process that had determined which clan women would become his wives involved competitions that tested combat abilities, loyalty, and psychological resilience, while requiring him to evaluate potential partners according to criteria that prioritized operational effectiveness over personal compatibility or romantic attraction. The marriages that resulted from these arrangements created relationships that combined genuine affection with professional partnership in ways that made it impossible to separate personal feelings from tactical considerations, as each wife's welfare became both emotional priority and strategic concern that influenced all mission planning and risk assessment. The retirement that followed his injuries during the Entertainment District mission reflected recognition that physical damage had compromised his combat effectiveness, while providing opportunity to prioritize family relationships that had been subordinated to Demon Slayer duties throughout his Ben career. The transition from active warrior to civilian life created challenges as he attempted to develop capacity for domestic happiness, while managing psychological conditioning that had prepared him for violence rather than peaceful existence, with loved ones whose safety no longer depended upon his willingness to sacrifice everything for their protection. The stone Hashira Gyomei Himejima bore guilt associated with false accusations that had blamed him for deaths of children under his care, accusations that resulted from misunderstanding of circumstances surrounding demon attack that claimed young lives, while sparing his own through spiritual protection that observers interpreted as evidence of complicity rather than divine intervention. The blindness that had prevented him from witnessing the massacre directly created additional burden, as his inability to provide eyewitness testimony allowed false narrative to persist, despite his desperate attempts to explain true nature of events that had cost innocent lives. The religious faith that sustained Gyomei through years of social ostracism and legal persecution provided framework for understanding suffering as test of spiritual commitment, while creating obligation to serve others regardless of personal cost or social recognition that might result from such service. The prayers that punctuated his daily activities reflected not merely devotional practice, but ongoing dialogue with divine forces that he believed had preserved his life for purposes that transcended individual happiness or worldly success, creating sense of mission that made personal sacrifice not only acceptable, but spiritually necessary. The strength that made him most physically powerful among all Hashira emerged through spiritual discipline that transformed emotional pain into physical capability, while channeling psychological energy toward protective service that could justify survival when so many innocent people had died while he lived. The tears that frequently accompanied his prayers reflected ongoing grief for children whose deaths continued to haunt him, while demonstrating emotional accessibility that contradicted stereotype of warriors as emotionally detached killers rather than deeply feeling human beings whose sensitivity motivated rather than hindered their combat effectiveness. The Flame Hashira Kyojiro Rengoku inherited family legacy that included father whose depression following wife's death had transformed him from inspirational leader into bitter alcoholic whose failure to fulfill Hashira responsibilities forced son to assume burdens that should have been shared across generations, rather than concentrated upon single individual who lacked adequate preparation for such overwhelming duties. The cheerful demeanor that characterized Kyojiro's public persona concealed awareness that family honor depended entirely upon his success, while any failure would reflect not merely personal inadequacy, but generational collapse of tradition that had sustained Rengoku clan through centuries of Demon Slayer service. The philosophy that emphasized protecting others regardless of personal cost reflected understanding that individual life derived meaning through service to broader human community, while creating worldview that made personal survival secondary consideration compared to operational success that could preserve lives of people whose welfare justified any sacrifice that circumstances might require. The enthusiasm that he displayed for Demon Slayer duties represented genuine joy in discovering purpose that aligned with personal values, while providing outlet for energy and capabilities that might otherwise have been wasted on pursuits that offered lesser opportunities for meaningful contribution to human welfare. The death that claimed him during the Infinity Train mission occurred while protecting passengers whose survival depended upon his willingness to fight beyond normal human limitations, while accepting injuries that made continued existence impossible, demonstrating commitment to protective service that transcended self-preservation instincts in favor of moral obligations that he considered more important than personal survival. The final words he spoke to Tanjiro reflected awareness that his approaching death could provide educational value for younger warriors while passing along wisdom and encouragement that could help them avoid similar fate through better preparation and strategic thinking. The missed Hashira Muichiro Tokito lost family and memories simultaneously when demon attack claimed his twin brother while inflicting head trauma that created amnesia so complete that his personality effectively died along with his relatives, leaving behind individual whose exceptional combat abilities existed without emotional foundation that could provide context for their application. The blank expression that characterized his face reflected not merely detachment but fundamental disconnection from personal history that might have explained why survival mattered, or what goals might justify continued existence beyond simple completion of assigned missions. The recovered memories that eventually returned during critical combat situations revealed extent of trauma that had been suppressed through psychological mechanisms designed to protect consciousness from information too painful to process, while maintaining functional capability that enabled continued Demon Slayer service. The brother whose death had triggered this defensive amnesia had provided emotional anchor that gave meaning to existence, while his loss removed primary source of motivation for caring about outcomes that did not directly affect mission, completion, or organizational objectives. The serpent Hashira Obanai Iguro survived childhood imprisonment that involved being raised as human sacrifice for demon who demanded periodic offerings of clan members in exchange for protection that enabled families' continued existence through arrangement that perpetuated cycle of victimization while providing illusion of security. The escape that eventually freed him from this situation occurred only after witnessing deaths of numerous relatives whose sacrifice had been intended to preserve his life while preparing him for eventual offering that would complete family's obligation to their demonic protector. The facial scars that marked him as survivor of demon attack served as permanent reminder of trauma, while making normal social interaction difficult due to visible evidence of supernatural encounter that most people preferred to ignore or deny rather than acknowledge reality of demonic threats that existed beyond their comfortable understanding of world's dangers. The mask that concealed these injuries provided psychological protection while enabling social function that might otherwise have been impossible due to reactions of fear or pity that facial damage typically provoked in observers, unaccustomed to evidence of supernatural violence. And so the Hashira reveal themselves as wounded healers whose greatest strength emerges from deepest trauma, each pillar supporting Demon Slayer core through architecture of pain that transforms personal anguish into protective power, capable of shielding others from suffering that might otherwise destroy human civilization's capacity for hope and healing. The night that shattered the Kamado family's peaceful existence unfolded with methodical cruelty that transformed their mountain sanctuary into scene of horror, so complete that even hardened demon slayers who later investigated the massacre struggled to comprehend the systematic nature of violence that had been visited upon innocent people whose only crime was existing in location where Muzan Kibutsuji had chosen to conduct his search for information about sun-breathing techniques and blue spider lily cultivation, methods that might advance his quest for immunity to sunlight's lethal effects. The approach that brought death to their doorstep occurred during hours when ordinary families gathered around heated tables to share evening meals and stories that strengthened bonds between generations. The very domesticity that made the Kamados vulnerable, also representing everything precious about human existence that demons sought to destroy through acts of predation that eliminated not merely individual lives but entire networks of love and mutual support that gave meaning to survival itself. The snow that had been falling since sunset created natural sound dampening that prevented screams from carrying to neighboring households while leaving tracks that would later tell investigators part of the story about what had transpired during those final terrible hours. The sequence of deaths that followed Muzan's arrival revealed calculated approach to family elimination that prioritized psychological torture over simple killing, as each member was forced to witness violence inflicted upon others before experiencing their own demise, creating atmosphere of terror that fed the demon's satisfaction, while ensuring that final moments were filled with anguish that exceeded physical pain to encompass complete despair about humanity's capacity for protection against supernatural evil. The positioning of bodies discovered the following morning suggested that family members had been arranged to maximize their awareness of each other's suffering, while preventing any possibility of mutual comfort or support during their dying moments. The mother Ki, who had dedicated her life to nurturing children through daily acts of love and sacrifice, became target for especially prolonged attention, as Muzan recognized that her death would cause maximum psychological damage to surviving family members, while providing him with sadistic pleasure derived from corrupting maternal instincts into sources of terror rather than comfort. The gentle hands that had prepared countless meals and soothed childhood injuries were transformed into weapons used against her own children through demonic manipulation that forced her to participate in violence that violated every principle of maternal protection while remaining conscious enough to experience full horror of actions she could not control. The younger children, whose innocence had been preserved through careful parental guidance, found themselves exposed to realities of supernatural evil that no human mind was designed to process. Their final experiences, including not merely physical pain, but complete destruction of worldview that had assumed safety, love, and parental protection represented permanent features of existence rather than temporary gifts that could be stripped away without warning or appeal to justice. The toys and personal belongings that surrounded their bodies created heartbreaking contrast between evidence of normal childhood development and scene of violence that had eliminated all possibility of continued growth and learning. The father figure that Tanjiro had tried to become for his siblings proved inadequate protection against threats that exceeded anything his mountain upbringing and enhanced senses could have prepared him to recognize or resist. His absence during critical hours, representing not personal failure but systemic inadequacy of human capabilities, when confronted with supernatural evil that operated according to rules that transcended normal understanding of predator behavior and defensive strategies. The timing of the attack reflected Muzan's careful observation of family patterns that enabled him to strike when protective resources were minimized, while ensuring maximum psychological impact through elimination of safety nets that had previously provided security. The investigation of scent traces that Tanjiro conducted upon discovering the massacre revealed olfactory evidence of prolonged terror that had filled the house during final hours, as pheromones associated with extreme fear had saturated wooden structures and textile materials in ways that created permanent record of psychological torture that had preceded physical violence. The layered nature of these scent signatures indicated that fear had intensified gradually rather than spiking suddenly, suggesting systematic approach to intimidation that had extended torture over a period lasting several hours rather than minutes. The defensive wounds that marked some family members' bodies provided evidence of attempts at resistance that had proven futile against supernatural strength and speed, while demonstrating courage that characterized Kamado family response to impossible circumstances. Their willingness to fight, despite obvious futility, reflecting values that Tanjiro had inherited and would later apply during his own confrontations with demonic evil. The positioning of these injuries suggested that family members had attempted to shield each other from attack, even when such protection was clearly impossible, creating tragic testimony to bonds of love that persisted even during moments of ultimate horror. The transformation that claimed Nezuko occurred through exposure to Muzan's blood during final moments of the massacre, when her injuries should have proven fatal but instead initiated demonic metamorphosis that preserved her life, while fundamentally altering her nature in ways that would create burden of guilt and responsibility for Tanjiro that exceeded simple grief to encompass ongoing obligation for managing supernatural condition he could neither cure nor fully understand. The biological processes that enabled her survival involved cellular changes that occurred too rapidly for human consciousness to track, while creating new form of existence that retained fragments of human awareness despite fundamental alteration of physical capabilities and dietary requirements. The selective nature of Nezuko's transformation raised questions about why Muzan had chosen to convert only one family member while killing others outright, suggesting either conscious decision-making process that evaluated each individual's potential value as demon subordinate, or random factors related to timing and blood exposure that created accidental preservation rather than deliberate recruitment. The psychological implications of surviving when others died created survivors' guilt that would complicate Nezuko's adjustment to demonic existence, while providing emotional foundation that enabled retention of human compassion, despite supernatural changes to her fundamental nature. The cleanup efforts that followed the massacre involved not merely removal of physical evidence, but systematic elimination of traces that might have provided information about Muzan's identity or methods to investigators who possessed sufficient knowledge of demonic behavior patterns to interpret forensic evidence correctly. The thoroughness of this destruction suggested either extensive experience with covering traces of similar attacks or natural instinct for operational security that reflected understanding of how law enforcement or demon slayer investigations might proceed if adequate evidence remained available for analysis. The timing of Tanjiro's return to discover the aftermath created psychological trauma that combined immediate shock of visual evidence with gradual understanding of implications that would shape his future existence. As initial focus on emergency medical response gave way to recognition that his entire worldview required reconstruction around realities that his previous experience had never prepared him to acknowledge or integrate into functional understanding of how existence operated. The progression from desperate hope for survival to acceptance of irreversible loss occurred over a period of hours that compressed normal grief processes into intensity that threatened to overwhelm psychological mechanisms designed to manage trauma through gradual adjustment rather than immediate confrontation with absolute devastation. The neighbors who might have provided assistance or witnessed events remained unaware of tragedy due to geographical isolation that had previously represented safety, but now revealed itself as vulnerability that prevented timely intervention, while ensuring that Kamados faced their final crisis without possibility of rescue or support from broader community. The distance that separated their home from other households reflected mountain living patterns that prioritized self-sufficiency over social integration, while creating conditions where family disasters could occur without external awareness until discoveries came too late for meaningful assistance. The decision-making process that Tanjiro faced upon discovering Nezuko's survival required him to choose between seeking immediate medical help that might have saved her human life, while risking exposure of her demonic transformation to authorities who would have ordered her execution, or accepting responsibility for managing supernatural condition that he lacked knowledge or resources to address effectively. The choice to prioritize her survival over conventional medical intervention reflected understanding that normal human institutions were inadequately equipped to deal with supernatural conditions, while demonstrating commitment to family, loyalty that would define his approach to subsequent challenges. The burial preparations that Tanjiro conducted for his deceased family members provided opportunities for final expressions of love and respect, while creating physical actions that enabled psychological processing of grief through meaningful activity that honored their memory, while beginning process of emotional adjustment to reality of permanent separation. The graves that he prepared with his own hands served as monuments to relationships that had given his life meaning, while establishing sacred space where he could maintain spiritual connection to loved ones despite physical absence that death had created. The prayers and promises that accompanied these burial rituals reflected attempt to maintain family bonds beyond biological death, while creating framework for future action that could honor their memory through service that aligned with values they had taught him during years of shared existence. The commitments he made to their spirits established mission parameters that would guide his subsequent development as Demon Slayer, while providing emotional foundation that could sustain him through trials that would test his dedication to principles they had instilled through daily example rather than formal instruction. The departure from ancestral home that followed completion of funeral rites marked psychological transition from childhood security to adult responsibility for survival in hostile world where supernatural threats required constant vigilance, while normal human support systems proved inadequate for managing challenges that exceeded ordinary experience and understanding. The possessions that he chose to carry reflected practical considerations about wilderness survival, while including symbolic items that maintained connection to family identity despite physical separation from locations where that identity had been formed and nurtured. The psychological adaptation that occurred during days following the massacre involved gradual acceptance of new reality, where personal safety remained secondary consideration compared to protective obligations towards surviving family member whose condition created ongoing vulnerability to threats that conventional wisdom was inadequately equipped to address or resolve. The mental framework that emerged from this adjustment process prioritized duty over comfort, while creating emotional structure that could function despite ongoing grief and uncertainty about future outcomes that remained largely beyond his control or prediction. And so the Kamado family massacre reveals itself as systematic destruction of innocence that transformed loving home into monument to human vulnerability, while creating psychological foundation for heroism that emerged not despite trauma, but because of it, as Tanjiro's dedication to protecting others grew from intimate knowledge of what it meant to lose everything that made existence meaningful, while discovering strength to continue when continuation seemed pointless, except as service to memory of those whose love had shaped his capacity for loving others despite world's demonstrated capacity for inflicting unimaginable pain upon those who deserved only happiness and security. Blood demon arts emerge from psychological crucibles where human trauma undergoes supernatural metamorphosis, transforming experiences of suffering into weaponized manifestations that enable demons to inflict upon others variations of the same anguish that originally drove their transformation from human to monster, creating a cycle of pain that perpetuates itself through generations, while demonstrating how deeply personal wounds can become tools for widespread destruction when channeled through supernatural capabilities that amplify individual trauma into forces capable of reshaping reality according to patterns established by original psychological damage. The developmental process through which demons acquire their unique blood demon arts reflects not random assignment of supernatural abilities, but systematic correlation between specific forms of human suffering and corresponding powers that enable recreation of similar experiences in victims who become unwilling participants in elaborate psychological experiments designed to validate and extend the emotional patterns that define each demon's core identity. The manifestation of these abilities occurs through biological changes that integrate traumatic memories with cellular structure in ways that make past pain accessible as present weapon, while ensuring that demons remain psychologically bound to circumstances that created their initial transformation. The spider demon, Rui, whose blood demon art enabled manipulation of threads that could bind and control other beings, developed this capability through childhood experiences of abandonment and rejection that created desperate need for family connections combined with fear of genuine intimacy that made authentic relationships psychologically impossible, leading to supernatural ability that could force others into familial roles while preventing them from exercising independence that might threaten his constructed social environment. The strength and sharpness of his threads reflected intensity of emotional pain that had driven his human development, while their binding properties demonstrated desire for control that emerged from powerlessness experienced during formative years when authentic love remained unavailable despite his disparate longing for acceptance. The artificial family structure that Rui created through application of his blood demon art represented an attempt to heal childhood wounds through recreation of idealized domestic relationships, where perfect obedience replaced authentic affection, while fear-based compliance substituted for genuine emotional connection, creating household where appearance of love masked reality of systematic abuse that reflected his inability to distinguish between control and care due to developmental trauma that had prevented acquisition of healthy relationship models. The torture that he inflicted upon family members who failed to meet his expectations demonstrated how traumatic experiences could be transformed into methodologies for perpetuating similar damage while providing psychological satisfaction that temporarily relieved existential pain through displacement onto victims whose suffering validated his own emotional reality. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Rui to rationalize his abusive behavior toward artificial family members reflected developmental arrest that had frozen his emotional growth at stage where external validation seemed more important than internal healing, while preventing recognition that authentic relationships required mutual respect rather than unilateral dominance enforced through supernatural coercion. The genuine confusion he displayed when confronted with evidence that his methods were producing fear rather than love illustrated how completely his transformation had disconnected him from human emotional reality while preserving desperate need for connections that his supernatural nature made impossible to achieve through healthy means. The lower moon demon Enmu, whose blood demon arts enabled manipulation of dreams and sleep states, developed these capabilities through experiences of chronic insomnia and nightmares that had dominated his human existence, while creating intimate familiarity with boundary regions between consciousness and unconsciousness, where psychological defenses became permeable to influences that waking minds would normally resist. The precision with which he could manipulate dream content reflected years of personal experience with sleep disorders that had provided detailed understanding of how consciousness operated during altered states, while creating expertise in psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for predatory purposes. The sadistic pleasure that Enmu derived from trapping victims within dreams that appeared to fulfill their deepest desires, while actually serving his feeding requirements, demonstrated how personal experience with psychological torment could be transformed into methodology for inflicting similar suffering upon others, while providing emotional satisfaction that compensated for pain that had never been adequately addressed or healed. The complexity of dream scenarios that he created reflected sophisticated understanding of human psychology, combined with creative intelligence that had been redirected toward destructive purposes, rather than healing or artistic expression that might have provided healthier outlets for his capabilities. The civilian accomplices that Enmu recruited to assist with his dream manipulation activities represented extension of his blood demon art's psychological influence beyond direct supernatural contact, to encompass ordinary humans whose vulnerabilities could be exploited through promises that appealed to desperate needs, while binding them to participation in activities that violated their normal moral frameworks. The tickets that served as vectors for his influence demonstrated understanding of how modern social customs and technological innovations could be integrated into supernatural predation methods, while maintaining operational security that prevented detection until victims were already compromised. Beyond easy rescue, the temporal distortion effects that characterized Enmu's dream manipulation created subjective experiences of extended duration within sleep states that lasted only minutes in objective reality, enabling psychological torture that could span apparent years while avoiding physical evidence that might alert authorities to supernatural predation occurring within their jurisdictions. The memories that victims retained after awakening carried emotional impact that exceeded simple nightmares to encompass genuine trauma responses that could affect their psychological stability long after direct contact with the demon had ended, creating ripple effects that extended his influence far beyond immediate feeding activities. The upper moon demon Daki, whose blood demon art enabled manipulation of obisashes that could function as extension of her physical form, developed these capabilities through experiences as human trafficking victim whose survival had depended upon understanding how fabric and clothing could be weaponized for both protection and attack, while learning to navigate social environments where appearance and deception represented primary tools for avoiding violence that threatened her continued existence. The integration of textile manipulation with her transformed physiology reflected intimate knowledge of how material culture could be used to conceal threats while enabling mobility that appeared elegant and harmless to observers unaware of supernatural dangers. The vanity that characterized Ducky's personality and influenced her choice of hunting grounds reflected psychological compensation for years of powerlessness and degradation that had been experienced during her human existence, while creating motivation for activities that enabled her to feel beautiful and desired even when those feelings were purchased through predation that eliminated sources of genuine admiration or affection. The mirror that served as focal point for her blood demon art represented ongoing need for external validation combined with narcissistic defense mechanisms that protected fragile self-image through elimination of anyone whose reactions might threaten her constructed identity as desirable and powerful being. The brother Gyutaro, whose blood demon art enabled manipulation of blood sickles that could poison victims through contact, represented parallel development where similar childhood trauma had produced different supernatural capabilities that complemented Daki's abilities while reflecting his role as protector, who had absorbed much of the physical violence that their circumstances had generated. The poison that coated his weapons carried biological signature of resentment and hatred that had accumulated through years of social rejection and economic desperation, while providing means for ensuring that even superficial wounds would prove fatal to enemies whose superior social status had previously made them untouchable. The shared consciousness that linked Daki and Gyutaro enabled coordination of their blood demon arts in ways that created tactical advantages, while reflecting psychological codependence that had developed through shared trauma experiences, where survival had required absolute trust and cooperation between siblings whose bond represented only reliable source of emotional support in environment that treated them as disposable commodities. The protective instincts that motivated Gyutaro's transformation into demon reflected genuine love that had been corrupted by supernatural influence, while retaining enough authentic emotion to create vulnerability that skilled opponents could potentially exploit. The drum demon Kyogai, whose blood demon art enabled spatial manipulation through percussive activation, developed these capabilities through frustrated artistic ambitions that had been crushed by social rejection and critical dismissal of creative work that represented his attempts to express inner life through cultural production that might have provided meaning and recognition if society had been capable of appreciating innovative approaches to traditional forms. The drums that served as focal points for his spatial manipulation reflected musical knowledge that had been redirected toward destructive purposes, while retaining aesthetic elements that suggested continuing need for artistic expression, even within context of predatory behavior. The rotating rooms and shifting corridors that characterized Kyogai's blood demon art created disorienting environments where normal navigation became impossible, while forcing victims to experience confusion and helplessness that mirrored his own psychological state during periods when creative rejection had left him uncertain about his identity and value as conscious being. The precision required for controlling these spatial effects demonstrated technical mastery that had been developed through years of musical practice, while showing how artistic skills could be transformed into supernatural weapons when channeled through demonic psychology that prioritized dominance over beauty. The swamp demon, whose blood demon art enabled creation of pocket dimensions that could trap and transport victims, developed these capabilities through experiences of social isolation and geographical displacement that had created intimate familiarity with liminal spaces where normal rules of physics and social interaction became suspended, while providing opportunities for predatory behavior that would have been impossible within conventional spatial frameworks. The liquid environments that characterized his dimensional manifestations reflected psychological state of emotional fluidity, where boundaries between self and other had become permeable in ways that enabled absorption of victims' experiences while maintaining separate identity that could benefit from such integration. The multiple body manifestation that enabled the swamp demon to appear simultaneously in different locations reflected fragmented sense of personal identity that had developed through traumatic experiences involving betrayal and Bessie, abandonment by individuals whose support had been crucial for psychological development, while creating internal divisions that supernatural transformation had literalized through creation of separate physical forms that shared consciousness while maintaining operational independence. The hand demon, whose blood demon art enabled manipulation of numerous arms and hands that could regenerate rapidly after damage, developed these capabilities through experiences involving manual labor and physical restraint that had created obsessive focus on control and manipulation, while associating hands with both creative potential and destructive capability, depending upon circumstances and motivations that guided their application. The regenerative properties of his additional limbs reflected psychological resilience that had enabled survival through circumstances that should have destroyed normal human consciousness, while demonstrating how trauma could create supernatural compensation for perceived inadequacies or limitations. The psychological satisfaction that the hand demon derived from describing deaths of previous demon slayers reflected need to validate his own survival and power through elimination of opponents whose capabilities exceeded his own during their human existence, while proving that supernatural enhancement could overcome advantages that formal training and natural talent had previously provided to enemies who had seemed invincible until confronted with abilities that existed outside normal parameters for human combat effectiveness. And so blood demon arts reveal themselves as crystallized trauma transformed into weapons that enable demons to recreate their own suffering within others, while seeking validation and relief that can never truly be achieved through external means, creating a cycle where personal pain becomes source of collective anguish that perpetuates itself across generations of victims whose only crime was existing within reach of predators whose supernatural abilities emerged from very human experiences of abandonment, abuse, rejection, and despair that transformation into monsters could amplify but never truly heal. The entertainment district that served as hunting ground for Daki and Gyutaro existed as carefully constructed theater of human desire, where economic desperation and social inequality created conditions that enabled systematic predation to flourish beneath veneer of cultural sophistication and artistic refinement, transforming legitimate businesses that should have provided livelihood and entertainment into elaborate traps where victims could be selected, isolated, and consumed without attracting attention from authorities whose corruption or willful blindness made them complicit in atrocities that exceeded simple criminal activity to encompass supernatural evil operating within structures of legal commerce. The Yoshiwara district that dominated this urban landscape represented convergence of legitimate entertainment culture with darker industries that exploited human vulnerability through economic coercion and social marginalization, creating an environment where young women whose families faced financial crisis could be sold into indentured servitude that differed from slavery only in legal terminology, while providing cover for supernatural predators who recognized that society's willingness to ignore suffering of economically powerless populations created perfect camouflage for activities that might otherwise attract unwanted investigation or intervention. The house of Ojimoto, where Daki operated under human identity of Warabahim, served as epicenter for predatory activities that combined supernatural hunting with conventional exploitation of women whose circumstances had made them dependent upon income from activities that society simultaneously demanded and condemned, creating psychological vulnerability that made resistance to supernatural influence more difficult, while ensuring that victims' disappearances would be attributed to normal hazards of dangerous profession rather than evidence of demonic predation requiring specialized response. The selection criteria that governed Daki's choice of victims reflected not random predatory behavior, but systematic targeting of individuals whose beauty, youth, and social status made them valuable commodities within entertainment district's economic structure, while ensuring that their elimination would create maximum psychological impact among remaining population, who understood that even the most successful and protected courtesans remained vulnerable to forces beyond human control or institutional protection. The careful timing of these disappearances prevented panic that might have disrupted business operations while maintaining an atmosphere of fear that made surviving women more compliant and easier to manipulate. The physical modifications that Daki's victims experienced during their final hours involved not merely consumption of flesh and blood, but systematic destruction of features that had made them valuable within entertainment. Economy, as if supernatural predator took particular satisfaction in eliminating beauty that had provided temporary protection against other forms of exploitation, while demonstrating that even advantageous physical characteristics could not guarantee safety in a world where supernatural evil operated according to rules that transcended human social hierarchies and economic relationships. The psychological torture that preceded these physical destructions involved forcing victims to witness degradation of their carefully constructed public identities as elegant entertainers whose artistic skills and cultural knowledge had elevated them above common prostitution, reducing them to terrified animals whose sophisticated education and refined mannerisms proved inadequate for managing realities of supernatural predation that existed beyond boundaries of human experience or cultural preparation. The mirrors that reflected their transformation from confident professionals to helpless prey served as instruments of psychological warfare that maximized emotional suffering while providing sadistic entertainment for demons whose own traumatic experiences had created need to validate power through elimination of individuals whose social advantages exceeded anything she had possessed during her human existence. The economic disruption that resulted from these systematic disappearances created ripple effects throughout Entertainment District's complex financial ecosystem, as businesses lost valuable employees whose training and development had required substantial investment, while their replacement proved difficult due to reputation for supernatural danger that began spreading through underground networks despite official silence about true nature of threats affecting local population. The reduction in available entertainment options made remaining establishments more valuable, while creating sellers' market that enabled exploitation of customers whose options had been artificially limited through predatory activity. The House of Kyogoku, where investigation initially focused, represented typical entertainment district business whose legitimate operations provided cover for supernatural activity while demonstrating how demons could integrate themselves into human economic structures without detection by authorities whose understanding of criminal activity remained limited to conventional categories that did not include supernatural predation, requiring specialized knowledge and equipment for effective response. The architectural modifications that enabled concealment of demonic activity reflected understanding of how building design could facilitate predatory behavior while maintaining appearances that satisfied regulatory inspection and customer expectations. The underground chambers that connected various entertainment district buildings created a network of concealed spaces where victims could be transported and processed without exposure to public observation, while enabling rapid movement between hunting grounds that appeared unconnected to casual observers, unaware of infrastructure that linked supposedly independent businesses through supernatural conspiracy that operated across multiple locations and organizational structures. The construction of these hidden passages required coordination between human accomplices whose silence was purchased through combination of financial incentives and threats of violence that made resistance economically and physically dangerous. The staff members who worked within these compromised establishments found themselves trapped between economic necessity that made employment essential for survival and growing awareness that their workplaces harbored supernatural dangers. that exceeded normal occupational hazards while providing no institutional protection or legal recourse for addressing concerns about colleague disappearances or unexplained phenomena that suggested presence of forces beyond human understanding or control. The psychological pressure created by this situation forced workers to choose between personal safety and economic security, while demonstrating how supernatural predators could exploit societal inequalities to maintain operational security. The customers who frequented entertainment district establishments remained largely unaware of supernatural dangers that surrounded them due to careful management of information and evidence that prevented widespread panic while enabling continued operation of businesses whose revenue streams depended upon maintaining illusion of safety and sophistication that attracted clientele seeking escape from mundane concerns through temporary immersion in world of beauty and pleasure that concealed underlying horror. The occasional disappearances of patrons were attributed to conventional criminal activity or personal misfortune rather than systematic predation that required acknowledgement of supernatural realities that most people preferred to deny or ignore. The law enforcement response to reports of missing persons reflected institutional limitations that made effective investigation impossible when crimes involved supernatural perpetrators whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal investigation procedures, while evidence remained subtle enough to permit alternative explanations that avoided confronting possibilities that lay beyond conventional understanding of criminal behavior and appropriate response methodologies. The corruption that characterized some official investigations reflected not merely moral failure, but psychological defense against information that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality and human capability for protecting citizens from threats that lay beyond normal institutional competence. The social hierarchies that governed entertainment district relationships created additional layers of vulnerability as individuals with less economic power or social protection found themselves exposed to greater risks while having fewer resources for seeking help or escaping dangerous situations that more privileged persons might have avoided through access to alternative employment opportunities or family support systems that provided safety nets during crises. The class distinctions that separated high-ranking courtesans from common workers created internal competition that prevented unified response to shared threats, while enabling supernatural predators to exploit social divisions for operational advantage. The cultural practices that surrounded entertainment district activities included customs and traditions that normalized certain forms of violence and exploitation while making it difficult for victims to distinguish between acceptable occupational hazards and supernatural predation that exceeded normal parameters for dangerous but legal work environments. The artistic training that workers received included instruction in managing difficult customers and avoiding conventional threats, while providing no preparation for recognizing or responding to demonic activity that operated according to completely different rules from human criminal behavior. The medical facilities that served entertainment district populations faced challenges in treating injuries and conditions that resulted from supernatural encounters, while lacking knowledge or equipment necessary for addressing wounds that healed abnormally or symptoms that suggested exposure to demonic influence rather than conventional trauma or disease. The physicians who attempted to provide care found themselves confronting evidence that challenged their medical training while being unable to discuss their observations with colleagues who might have provided consultation, collaborative problem-solving approaches. The seasonal cycles that governed entertainment district business operations created periods of increased vulnerability when economic pressures intensified while regular customers traveled or reduced their discretionary spending, forcing establishments to accept higher-risk clientele or engage in activities that might otherwise have been avoided through more selective approaches to customer relations and business practices. The festival periods that brought temporary increases in visitor populations provided enhanced hunting opportunities for supernatural predators, while creating cover for unusual activities that might have attracted attention during quieter periods. The architectural features that characterized entertainment district buildings reflected centuries of evolution toward designs that balanced public accessibility with private security, while incorporating elements that could facilitate both legitimate business operations and illicit activities that required concealment from official observation or competitor surveillance. The interior layouts that enabled rapid movement between public and private spaces provided tactical advantages for supernatural predators, while creating maze-like environments where human victims could become disoriented and trapped, without possibility of escape or rescue. The communication networks that connected entertainment district businesses enabled coordination of activities while maintaining operational security that prevented outside interference or investigation that might have exposed supernatural predation to authorities capable of mounting effective response through deployment of specialized personnel and equipment designed for addressing demonic threats. The informal intelligence systems that developed among workers provided early warning of unusual dangers while remaining inadequate for addressing supernatural threats that exceeded human capability for resistance or escape. And so the entertainment district reveals itself as perfect hunting ground, where economic desperation meets supernatural evil within structures that society simultaneously creates and denies, enabling predators to operate with impunity, while their victims' suffering remains invisible to those whose willful blindness permits continuation of horrors that flourish in shadows cast by human greed and institutional indifference. To vulnerable populations whose welfare matters less than profit margins and social respectability, the psychological metamorphosis that accompanies transformation from human to demon unfolds through stages of consciousness alteration that systematically dismantle the cognitive and emotional frameworks that define human identity, replacing compassion with predatory instinct while preserving sufficient intellectual capacity to enable sophisticated hunting strategies that make demonic predation far more dangerous than simple animal aggression could ever achieve. The process begins with cellular changes that alter brain chemistry in ways that gradually shift perception of other humans, from fellow beings deserving empathy and protection to potential sources of sustenance, whose suffering becomes irrelevant compared to the satisfaction their consumption provides to appetites that conventional food can no longer satisfy. The initial stage of this transformation involves retention of human memories and emotional connections, while experiencing gradual weakening of moral inhibitions that had previously prevented consideration of violence against innocent clays. People, creating internal conflict between remembered human values and emerging demonic impulses that demand increasingly aggressive responses to situations that human consciousness would have resolved through negotiation or avoidance. The confusion that characterizes this early phase often manifests through desperate attempts to maintain human relationships and behavioral patterns, despite supernatural changes that make such continuity psychologically and physically impossible, as new needs assert dominance over familiar motivations. The erosion of empathy that follows these initial changes occurs through biological modifications to neural structures responsible for processing emotional information about other individuals, as mirror neurons that enable understanding of others' experiences become less responsive. while brain regions associated with predatory behavior receive enhanced blood flow and neurochemical stimulation that rewards thoughts and actions directed toward hunting and consumption. The psychological satisfaction that emerges from contemplating violence gradually replaces social rewards that had previously motivated cooperative behavior, while making solitary predatory activity more appealing than community participation that requires ongoing consideration of others' welfare. The memory degradation that accompanies advanced stages of demonic transformation operates selectively to preserve information that supports predatory behavior, while systematically eliminating recollections that might create emotional barriers to violence against former friends, family members, or community associates whose continued existence in demons' awareness could interfere with efficient hunting activities. The human names, faces, and relationships that disappear from conscious recollection are replaced by categorization systems that evaluate potential victims according to nutritional value, accessibility, and threat level rather than personal history or emotional significance that might complicate feeding decisions. The personality changes that result from this memory modification often involve development of new interests and behavioral patterns that align with demonic nature while bearing little resemblance to human identity that had characterized pre-transformation existence, as hobbies, values, and social preferences undergo radical alteration to support lifestyle based entirely upon predatory activity, rather than creative or collaborative pursuits that had previously provided meaning and satisfaction. The artistic talents, intellectual curiosity, and emotional sensitivity that had distinguished individual personality become subordinated to hunting efficiency, while losing connection to human cultural contexts that had originally nurtured their development. The retention of human intelligence that persists despite these psychological changes enables demons to develop sophisticated strategies for concealment, manipulation, and victim selection that far exceed capabilities of mindless predators, while allowing them to integrate into human society through elaborate deceptions that can be maintained for extended periods without detection. The social skills that survive transformation become tools for identifying vulnerabilities in potential prey, while enabling acquisition of resources and information that support predatory activities through exploitation of trust and affection that humans continue to feel despite interacting with creatures whose fundamental nature has been completely altered. The emotional numbing that characterizes advanced demonic psychology involves loss of capacity for experiencing genuine joy, sadness, love, or fear in ways that had connected human consciousness to broader community of living beings, replaced by simplified reward system based entirely upon feeding satisfaction and dominance. Assertion that provides temporary pleasure, but lacks depth or complexity that had made human emotional life meaningful, despite its accompanying vulnerabilities and painful experiences. The relationships that demons form with other supernatural beings tend to be transactional rather than emotionally fulfilling, while remaining adequate for operational cooperation that serves mutual interests in hunting efficiency and territorial security. The moral framework that governs demonic decision-making reflects complete abandonment of ethical principles that had guided human behavior in favor of pragmatic calculations based entirely upon personal advantage and feeding opportunities. As concepts of right and wrong become irrelevant compared to assessments of what actions will produce desired outcomes, regardless of their impact upon other individuals or broader community welfare. The justification systems that demons develop for their predatory behavior typically involve rationalization of human weakness and moral inadequacy, rather than acknowledgement of their own transformation from beings capable of ethical behavior into creatures whose nature makes such behavior impossible. The case of Akaza represents fascinating exception to typical patterns of moral degradation that accompany demonic transformation, as his retention of personal principles that prevented consumption of women demonstrated how deeply ingrained ethical frameworks could sometimes survive supernatural conversion, while creating internal conflicts that limited effectiveness as predator despite centuries of existence as demon. The psychological tension that resulted from maintaining human moral standards while possessing demonic nature created ongoing suffering that exceeded simple hunger to encompass existential crisis about identity and purpose that had no clear resolution within framework of supernatural existence. The strength limitations that Akaza accepted through adherence to his moral principles reflected conscious decision to prioritize ethical consistency over maximum power acquisition, demonstrating how human values could persist as constraining influences upon demonic behavior when individual possessed sufficient psychological strength to resist temptations that offered enhanced capabilities in exchange for moral compromise. The respect that he maintained for human fighting spirit and dedication to improvement suggested retention of appreciation for qualities that had characterized his own human existence, despite transformation that should have eliminated such sentiments through systematic neurological modification. The internal struggle that characterized Akaza's demonic existence involved ongoing conflict between memories of human identity that continued to influence his behavior and supernatural instincts that demanded complete abandonment of ethical constraints in favor of pure predatory focus, creating psychological complexity that distinguished him from other demons whose transformations had proceeded more completely toward elimination of human characteristics. The moments when his human memories surfaced during combat situations provided glimpses of personality that had existed before transformation, while demonstrating how deeply buried human consciousness could occasionally reassert itself, despite centuries of supernatural influence, designed to eliminate such remnants. The hunger that drives demonic behavior operates through biological mechanisms that create addiction-like dependence upon human flesh and blood, while making conventional food sources inadequate for maintaining physical health and mental stability, forcing even demons who retain moral sensitivity to choose between starvation and activities that violate their ethical principles. The psychological torture involved in experiencing constant hunger, while recognizing moral implications of satisfying that hunger, creates internal conflict that can persist for decades or centuries without resolution, as neither feeding nor abstinence provides sustainable approach to managing supernatural condition. The social isolation that results from demonic transformation reflects not merely practical considerations about concealing supernatural nature from human observation, but psychological inability to maintain meaningful relationships with beings whose experiences and motivations have become fundamentally incompatible with demonic existence, creating loneliness that exceeds normal human experience of social disconnection to encompass complete alienation from community of conscious beings who share capacity for growth, learning, and ethical development. The territorial behaviors that characterize demonic social organization reflect simplified social structures based entirely upon dominance hierarchies, rather than complex relationship networks that had characterized human community participation. As cooperation becomes limited to strategic alliances that serve immediate practical purposes while lacking emotional bonds or shared values that could provide foundation for genuine friendship or family relationships. The competition for resources and status that governs interactions between demons prevents development of trust or mutual support, that could reduce psychological isolation while ensuring that supernatural beings remain focused upon individual survival rather than collective welfare. The attempts at rehabilitation that occasionally occur when demons encounter humans who demonstrate exceptional compassion or courage sometimes create opportunities for partial recovery of human characteristics, though such transformations remain limited by biological changes that cannot be reversed through psychological intervention alone, while requiring ongoing support and monitoring that human society is typically unprepared to provide. The success stories that emerge from these rare rehabilitation attempts often involve demons whose transformation had been incomplete or whose human identity had been preserved through exceptional circumstances that protected core personality elements from complete supernatural conversion. The research into demonic psychology that has been conducted by individuals like Tamayo reveals biological and psychological mechanisms that govern transformation processes, while suggesting theoretical possibilities for interventions that might prevent complete loss of human identity or enable partial recovery of emotional and moral capabilities that supernatural conversion typically eliminates permanently. The medical and scientific approaches to understanding demonic condition provide hope that future developments might enable treatment or prevention of supernatural transformation through therapeutic interventions that address root causes, rather than merely managing symptoms of altered consciousness and behavioral changes. And so demonic transformation reveals itself as systematic destruction of human identity through biological processes that preserve intelligence while eliminating compassion, creating beings whose sophisticated capabilities serve predatory instincts that operate without ethical constraints, while demonstrating how thin the boundaries remain between human consciousness and supernatural evil that can emerge when biological foundations of moral behavior undergo fundamental alteration through forces that exist beyond normal understanding of psychological development and therapeutic intervention. The final battle that would determine humanity's fate unfolded across multiple fronts, where demon slayers whose lives had been dedicated to protecting innocent people found themselves confronting not merely individual demons, but coordinated assault by supernatural forces whose centuries of, quote, accumulated power and strategic planning had created military campaign designed to eliminate human resistance once and for all, while establishing demonic dominance over a world that had previously offered hope for coexistence between natural and supernatural forces. The scale of destruction that accompanied this ultimate confrontation exceeded anything previous generations had experienced, while revealing true cost of victory against enemies whose defeat required sacrifices that would fundamentally alter survivor, psychology, and social structures for generations to come. The Infinity Castle that served as primary battlefield represented architectural impossibility, where normal laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolute constraints, creating combat environment that challenged every assumption demon slayers had developed about tactical positioning and environmental advantages, while forcing adaptation to spatial relationships that shifted according to demonic will, rather than predictable patterns that training had prepared warriors to exploit. The disorienting effects of constantly changing geometry created psychological stress that exceeded simple combat anxiety to encompass existential vertigo that threatened mental stability of fighters whose effectiveness depended upon maintaining clear understanding of their surroundings and strategic options. The Upper Moon demons who defended this supernatural fortress represented pinnacle of demonic evolution, whose individual capabilities had been refined through centuries of combat experience, while their coordinated tactics demonstrated strategic thinking that exceeded simple predatory behavior to encompass military planning that recognized demon slayer strengths and prepared countermeasures designed to neutralize advantages that human warriors had traditionally relied upon for survival against supernatural opponents. The psychological warfare that accompanied their physical attacks involved systematic attempts to demoralize human fighters through revelation of personal information and traumatic memories that demons had acquired through intelligence, operations, or supernatural perception abilities. The Hashira who led this desperate assault carried with them awareness that their enhanced capabilities would be purchased through abbreviated lifespans, while their tactical decisions required balancing immediate combat effectiveness against long-term survival prospects for subordinate fighters whose welfare remained their responsibility, despite circumstances that made traditional leadership structures inadequate for managing crisis that exceeded normal parameters for military operations. The Demon Slayer mark manifestations that enabled superhuman performance created visual symbols of heroism that inspired courage while serving as countdown timers that reminded observers of mortality that enhanced abilities could delay but never permanently avoid. The casualties that began accumulating during early phases of the battle reflected not merely individual combat failures, but systematic breakdown of organizational structures that had sustained Demon Slayer operations for centuries. As communication networks failed under supernatural interference, while supply lines became disrupted by spatial distortions that made conventional logistics impossible to maintain. The medical support systems that should have provided treatment for wounded fighters proved inadequate when injuries involved supernatural toxins and blood demon artifacts that exceeded normal therapeutic knowledge, while requiring innovations that battlefield conditions prevented medical personnel from developing or implementing effectively. The psychological impact of witnessing fellow warriors die, despite their legendary skills and dedicated training, created trauma responses among survivors that threatened combat effectiveness, while demonstrating how quickly confidence could transform into despair when faced with enemies whose capabilities exceeded everything previous experience had suggested might be possible for supernatural opponents to achieve. The leadership vacuum that emerged as senior officers fell in combat forced rapid promotion of younger fighters whose preparation for command responsibilities remained incomplete, while circumstances demanded immediate decision-making that could determine survival prospects for entire units. The Flame Hashira Kyojiro Rengoku, whose death during preliminary encounters with Upper Moon demons provided tragic preview of losses that would characterize the final campaign, while demonstrating how even peak human performance enhanced through Demon Slayer mark manifestation could prove inadequate when confronting supernatural opponents whose power levels exceeded anything conventional training had prepared warriors to face. The inspiration that his sacrifice provided to surviving fighters created psychological foundation for continued resistance, despite mounting evidence that victory might be impossible to achieve through conventional combat methods. The Love Hashira Mitsuri Kanroji, whose fighting spirit enabled her to continue battling despite severe injuries that should have rendered her incapable of continued combat, demonstrated how emotional connections to fellow fighters and civilian populations could provide motivation that transcended physical limitations while creating tactical advantages through unpredictable behavior patterns that confused enemies whose strategic planning had not anticipated such extreme dedication. The loss of her distinctive optimism and cheerful demeanor as battle progressed illustrated psychological toll that prolonged combat against overwhelming odds imposed upon even the most resilient personalities. The missed Hashira Muichiro Tokito, whose youth made his participation in such devastating combat particularly tragic, while his recovered memories provided emotional depth that enhanced his fighting capability through connection to personal bands. History that gave meaning to sacrifice beyond simple duty to organizational objectives. The strategic thinking that he demonstrated during critical moments reflected intellectual development that circumstances had forced to mature rapidly, while suggesting potential that would remain forever unrealized due to early death that final battle demanded from its participants. The serpent Hashira Obanai Iguro, whose devotion to love Hashira Mitsuri created personal stakes that exceeded professional obligation, while his fighting style reflected psychological damage that had been transformed into tactical advantage through years of training that channeled trauma into effective combat technique. The protective instincts that motivated his most desperate fighting efforts demonstrated how personal relationships could provide strength that purely professional dedication might not have generated, while creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through psychological warfare designed to undermine emotional stability. The stone Hashira Gyome Himejima, whose physical strength exceeded that of all other Hashira, while his spiritual foundation provided psychological resilience that enabled continued function despite witnessing horrors that broke the minds of fighters whose religious faith provided less comprehensive framework for understanding suffering and sacrifice as necessary elements of cosmic justice. The prayers that punctuated his combat activities reflected ongoing communication with divine forces that he believed sanctioned his participation in violence, while providing moral authority that justified actions that circumstances made necessary for protecting innocent people. The insect Hashira Shinobu Kocho, whose final battle involved self-sacrifice through poison deployment that transformed her own body into weapon designed to eliminate Upper Moon Demon, whose death had become more important than her personal survival, while demonstrating how scientific knowledge could be weaponized through desperate measures that conventional combat techniques could not achieve. The calculated nature of her sacrifice reflected analytical thinking that had evaluated tactical options while accepting personal costs that love for deceased sister and commitment to protecting others made psychologically acceptable despite their finality. The sound Hashira Tengen Uzui, whose retirement following earlier injuries prevented his participation in final battle while creating survivor's guilt that accompanied knowledge that his combat experience and tactical capabilities might have made difference in outcomes that claimed lives of colleagues whose friendship had provided meaning beyond simple professional relationships. The domestic happiness that he achieved through marriage to 3 wives created contrast with tragedy that befell unmarried Hashira, whose personal connections remained limited to professional relationships that ended in premature death. The water Hashira Giyu Tomioka, whose survival through final battle came at psychological cost that included witnessing deaths of colleagues whose capabilities had often exceeded his own, while creating additional layer of survivors' guilt that compounded existing trauma from previous losses that had shaped his entire approach to Demon Slayer service. The emotional numbness that had protected him throughout his career became inadequate for processing scale of loss that final battle generated, while leaving him among few experienced fighters capable of training next generation if such. Training proved necessary for managing post-war supernatural threats. The Wind Hashira Sanemi Shinazugawa, whose aggressive fighting style reflected psychological damage that had been channeled into effective combat techniques, while his survival required witnessing death of younger brother Genya, whose participation in final battle had been motivated by desire for reconciliation that circumstances made impossible to achieve before fatal injuries, eliminated opportunities for family healing that both brothers had unconsciously desired despite their apparent hostility. The death of Genya Shinazugawa represented particularly cruel loss, as his unique physiology that enabled consumption of demon flesh for temporary supernatural enhancement had provided tactical capabilities that no other demon slayer possessed, while his youth suggested potential for long career that could have contributed to post-war reconstruction efforts. The final moments that he shared with his brother created opportunity for emotional reconciliation that had seemed impossible due to accumulated resentment and misunderstanding, while demonstrating how proximity to death could eliminate barriers that normal circumstances had made insurmountable. The temporary transformation of Tanjiro Kamado into Demon King represented ultimate crisis that threatened to transform victory over Muzan into Pyrrhic triumph that eliminated primary threat, while creating new supernatural overlord whose power exceeded anything previous demon hierarchy had achieved. The psychological horror that accompanied watching beloved colleague undergo transformation that eliminated his human consciousness while preserving his physical form created trauma that exceeded simple combat stress to encompass existential crisis about nature of heroism and sacrifice that demon slayer service demanded from its practitioners. The medical intervention that enabled Tanjiro's restoration to human form involved experimental treatments that combined scientific knowledge with spiritual healing, while requiring coordinated efforts from survivors whose own injuries and exhaustion made such complex procedures extremely dangerous to attempt under battlefield conditions. The uncertainty about long-term effects of Demon King transformation created ongoing anxiety about whether apparent recovery represented complete restoration or temporary reprieve that might fail under future stress or supernatural influence. The civilian casualties that resulted from final battle's spillover effects into populated areas created moral burden for surviving demon slayers whose protective mission had been compromised by tactical necessities that prioritized defeating primary threats over minimizing collateral damage, creating psychological conflict between professional success and personal values that demanded protection of innocent people, regardless of strategic considerations. And so the final battle reveals itself as Pyrrhic victory, where humanity's survival was purchased through sacrifices that fundamentally altered survivor psychology, while creating a world where memories of loss overshadowed celebration of triumph, demonstrating how even successful resistance against supernatural evil carries costs that extend far beyond simple casualty statistics to encompass permanent changes in human consciousness and social structure that make peace different from anything that had existed before war began. The modern era that emerged from humanity's victory over the demonic threat carried within its apparent peace the shadows of unresolved trauma that would influence generations yet unborn, as the world that survivors created bore invisible scars from conflicts that official histories would never fully document, while the psychological wounds inflicted by supernatural warfare continued to shape human consciousness in ways that peaceful societies struggle to understand or address through conventional healing methodologies. The silence that surrounded these events reflected not merely institutional secrecy but collective inability to process experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, while creating knowledge burdens that seemed too pale, dangerous to preserve, yet too important to allow complete disappearance from human memory. The last demon, Yushiro, whose survival represented both tragic isolation and crucial link to supernatural knowledge that might prove essential for recognizing future threats, found himself condemned to eternal existence among beings whose mortal lifespans prevented them from developing deep understanding of cosmic forces that had shaped the conflict between human and demon civilizations. The artistic works that he continued creating served as monuments to Tamayo's memory, while providing coded records of demon physiology and supernatural phenomena that future researchers might need to understand if similar threats ever emerged to challenge human survival again. Yet, the loneliness that accompanied his immortal perspective created psychological burden that no human relationship could adequately address or comprehend. The paintings that documented Tamayo's appearance and personality represented desperate attempt to preserve memory of individual whose scientific contributions and moral courage had made victory possible, while her demonic nature prevented normal commemorative practices that human society employed to honor fallen heroes. The gallery spaces where these works were displayed became pilgrimage destinations for individuals who possessed fragments of knowledge about supernatural conflicts, while serving as gathering points where rumors and partial truths could be exchanged among people whose family histories included unexplained gaps or mysterious disappearances that might have been connected to demonic activity. The genetic trauma that survivors passed to their descendants operated through biological mechanisms that remained poorly understood, while creating predispositions toward anxiety disorders, hypervigilance, and stress responses that seemed disproportionate to contemporary threats that lacked supernatural dimensions. The children and grandchildren of demon slayers demonstrated enhanced reflexes and sensory sensitivity that provided advantages in certain circumstances while creating difficulties in social situations where their heightened awareness of potential dangers made normal relaxation impossible to achieve or maintain for extended periods. The breathing techniques that had enabled supernatural combat effectiveness became family traditions whose original purposes were forgotten, while their physical benefits continued to provide health advantages for practitioners who understood them as meditation or exercise rather than preparation for battles against enemies whose existence they could not imagine or believe, despite evidence that surrounded them in family legends and unexplained customs. The forms and patterns that had been developed for sword combat evolved into dance movements and artistic expressions that preserved essential elements, while concealing martial applications that peaceful societies had no apparent need to maintain. The weapons that had been forged for demon-slaying activities became family heirlooms, whose supernatural properties remained dormant, while their exceptional craftsmanship made them valuable antiques that collectors acquired without understanding their true purpose, or the specialized metallurgy that had enabled effectiveness against opponents whose regenerative capabilities made conventional weapons inadequate for permanent elimination. The swordsmiths, whose knowledge had enabled creation of these supernatural weapons, took their secrets to graves, while their apprentices learned conventional techniques that could not replicate the unique properties that had made Demon Slayer Blaze effective against supernatural opponents. The Demon Slayer core infrastructure that had supported operations across multiple regions underwent systematic dismantling, as organizational leadership recognized that peacetime conditions made military structure inappropriate, while the specialized knowledge and equipment that had enabled supernatural warfare required careful preservation or disposal to prevent misuse by individuals who lacked understanding of their proper applications. The safe houses and supply depots that had supported field operations were converted to civilian purposes, while their hidden chambers and defensive modifications remained as architectural curiosities whose significance would be lost to future occupants. The medical knowledge that had been developed for treating supernatural injuries and managing demon slayer mark effects became foundation for advances in conventional medicine, while the spiritual and psychological insights that had enabled warriors to maintain sanity during encounters with cosmic, evil-informed therapeutic approaches that helped trauma survivors recover from experiences that exceeded normal human resilience. The hospitals and clinics that grew from these innovations provided healing services while concealing their origins in supernatural warfare that contemporary society preferred to forget or dismiss as primitive superstition. The educational systems that emerged in post-war society included subtle modifications designed to develop psychological resilience and moral courage, while avoiding explicit instruction in supernatural combat techniques that peaceful conditions made unnecessary, creating curricula that prepared young people for challenges they might face without revealing the full scope of dangers that human civilization had survived through sacrifice and dedication of previous generations. The teachers who implemented these programs often possessed incomplete understanding of their ultimate purposes, while their students learned valuable life skills without realizing their connection to military training that had saved human civilization. The economic development that characterized post-war reconstruction included industries and technologies that had been developed to support demon slayer operations, while their peacetime applications provided foundation for prosperity that enabled society to forget the desperate circumstances that had originally motivated their creation. The manufacturing capabilities that had produced specialized equipment for supernatural warfare proved equally effective for civilian purposes, while the organizational expertise that had coordinated military operations enabled efficient management of reconstruction projects that rebuilt damaged communities. The cultural changes that accompanied transition to peaceful society included gradual abandonment of traditions and customs that had developed during periods of supernatural threat, while their replacement by more optimistic practices reflected collective desire to believe that humanity's future would differ qualitatively from its traumatic past. Yet, the psychological patterns that had enabled survival during demonic conflict continued to influence social behavior in ways that created tensions between security needs and democratic ideals that peacetime societies struggled to balance effectively. The international relationships that developed as different regions shared knowledge about supernatural threats, created diplomatic frameworks that enabled cooperation against future dangers, while their public aspects focused on conventional security concerns that populations could understand without confronting realities of cosmic evil that exceeded normal political categories. The intelligence networks that had been established for tracking demon activity evolved into systems for monitoring other potential threats, while maintaining capabilities that might prove essential if supernatural dangers ever returned to challenge human survival. The technological development that accelerated during post-war period included innovations that had been inspired by demon slayer equipment and techniques, while their civilian applications provided economic benefits that justified continued research without revealing military origins that might have created public anxiety about reasons for such specialized development. The scientific knowledge that had been gained through study of demonic physiology and supernatural phenomena became foundation for advances in biology and physics, while the spiritual insights that had enabled resistance to demonic influence informed psychological research that helped people develop resilience against various forms of mental manipulation. The religious and philosophical movements that emerged from contact between human and supernatural worldviews created new approaches to understanding existence, while their adherents often remained unaware of specific experiences that had inspired these developments. leading to spiritual practices that provided genuine benefits while concealing their origins in desperate attempts to find meaning and strength during humanity's darkest hours, when survival required faith that exceeded normal human capacity for hope and determination. The archaeological evidence that remained from supernatural conflicts became subjects for academic research that attempted to explain anomalous findings through conventional theories, while the true significance of unusual artifacts and site characteristics remained hidden from scholars who lacked context necessary for accurate interpretation of physical remains that told stories too disturbing for peaceful societies to acknowledge or integrate into accepted historical narratives. The family stories and oral traditions that preserved fragments of supernatural history became folklore that entertained children while teaching moral lessons about courage and sacrifice, whose deeper meanings remained accessible only to individuals whose family backgrounds provided keys for understanding symbolic content that appeared merely fictional to casual listeners who lacked personal connections to events being commemorated through these narrative forms. The possibility that new supernatural threats might emerge from sources unrelated to the defeated demon hierarchy created ongoing anxiety among those who understood that humanity's victory had addressed specific challenges while leaving open questions about whether other forms of cosmic evil might eventually arise to test human resilience and organizational capabilities that had been developed through previous conflicts, but might prove inadequate for addressing different types of supernatural enemies whose capabilities and motivations could exceed anything previous experience had prepared defenders to recognize or counter effectively. And so the modern era reveals itself as time of hidden knowledge and forgotten wisdom, where humanity's greatest victory created foundation for peace that few could truly appreciate, while the vigilance necessary for maintaining that peace required constant awareness of threats that most people remained psychologically unable to acknowledge or prepare for, despite evidence that surrounded them in family traditions and cultural practices whose true significance had been deliberately obscured to protect mental health of populations, whose happiness depended upon forgetting horrors that their ancestors had faced and overcome through sacrifices that peaceful societies could neither understand nor adequately commemorate. And so we reach the end of our journey through shadows, where the darkest theories of Demon Slayer have whispered their secrets like wind through ancient graveyards, each revelation adding weight to understanding that heroism and horror walk hand in hand through worlds where supernatural evil tests the boundaries of human endurance and moral courage. The theories we have explored together reveal how deeply personal trauma shapes cosmic conflicts, while demonstrating that even in universes where demons feast upon human flesh and cursed marks doom warriors to early graves, the capacity for love and sacrifice endures as humanity's greatest weapon against forces that seek to transform compassion into cruelty and hope into despair. These dark truths remind us that strength often emerges not from avoiding suffering, but from choosing how to respond when suffering becomes unavoidable. That heroes are forged in furnaces of loss that would destroy lesser souls, while their light shines brightest in darkness that threatens to consume everything beautiful about existence. As you drift toward peaceful slumber, gentle soul who has walked with us through these shadowed valleys, carry with you the knowledge that even the bleakest theories contain seeds of hope, for in every tale of corruption overcome and every curse broken through determination, we find evidence that human spirit remains unconquerable by any darkness that dares challenge its capacity for renewal and redemption.